It had always been the three of us, me, my brother Ben, and our parents, though it never really felt that way. From the outside, we were the picture of a perfect family. But inside, the air was often thick with unspoken tension, especially when it came to our family home. A house my parents always spoke of with pride but never really seemed to want to share. It was ours, yet somehow it was always Ben's. At least that's how it felt. Growing up, he was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. I, on the other hand, was always second place and afterthought in most decisions. It wasn't that I wasn't loved, it was just that Ben had always been the priority. So when the will was read, I wasn't surprised. My parents had left everything to Ben, including the house. And me? I was supposed to be happy for him, to let him carry the weight of our inheritance without complaint. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something about it didn't sit right. Ben was ecstatic, of course. He had always expected it. His confidence in the family's choices was something I envied but also resented. He thought he deserved it, and in a way, he did. He had always been the one to spend time with our parents, the one who had their attention. But as the months passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, our home, wasn't really his to take. One day, as I was cleaning out some old family papers, I stumbled across something that would change everything. A letter from a lawyer, buried beneath some old receipts, addressed to me. My heart skipped a beat as I read through the letter. It wasn't just a letter, it was the truth. The inheritance, the house, everything my parents had left behind. It was all supposed to be mine, not Ben's. The revelation hit me like a wave. My parents, perhaps without realizing it, had left me the real legacy, though Ben had been given the deed, the power, and everything else. The letter was clear. I was the beneficiary. I was the one who had been chosen. The next few weeks were a blur. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, hoping that the letter was some kind of mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't. I wasn't just overlooked. I was outright excluded, lied to, and erased. The house, my inheritance, the place that held all our family's memories, was meant to be mine. I began to gather evidence, digging through every possible file, every record, and every document I could find. The more I dug, the more I understood the game Ben and our parents had been playing. They had all known, or at least Ben had, that I was the rightful heir. Yet, somehow, the system had been rigged against me. I had to confront him, confront them all, and tell him what I had learned. I couldn't do it at first. The guilt, the anger, and the sense of betrayal all wrapped into one heavy, suffocating weight. But there came a moment, a single quiet evening when Ben and I were alone, that I finally broke. I showed him the letter. His face turned pale as he read through it slowly, as though he couldn't believe what was in front of him. At first, he laughed. He thought I was joking. But then the shock set in. "What is this?" he asked, almost in disbelief, his voice cracking. I didn't say anything at first, just let the truth hang in the air between us. "How could they do this?" he whispered, almost to himself. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to the memory of our parents, now gone. The silence was heavy, but it didn't last. His face twisted with frustration. "You can't take this from me. You're just going to walk in and claim everything?" he shouted. "You don't deserve this." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had been prepared for some anger, but the intensity of it caught me off guard. His words stung, but I held my ground. "I'm not taking anything from you, Ben," I said quietly. "It was never yours to begin with." Ben's reaction was nothing like I expected. He didn't break down. He didn't plead. Instead, he tried to use every argument he could think of to make me doubt myself. "You don't understand what this house means," he said, as though I had never spent a single summer there. He tried to tell me how he had always been the one to carry the family name, to be the one our parents trusted. And maybe, in his mind, that was true. But I couldn't let him rewrite history. I couldn't let him make me feel like I didn't deserve this. The truth was right there in front of both of us. But Ben wasn't ready to accept it. He accused me of betraying him, of using our parents' love against him, and it made me wonder if I was wrong to feel this way. Days passed, and the tension between us simmered, but neither of us knew how to move forward. Ben tried to manipulate me into letting him have the house, suggesting ways we could share it, though it was clear to both of us that his offer came with strings attached. I was disgusted. How could he even think about asking me to share something that was mine by right? I had to make a decision. I could either take the inheritance and run with it, or I could do what felt impossible, talk to our parents, but I couldn't reach out to them. They were gone, and their choices had already shaped everything. In the end, I chose the hard path. I went to a lawyer. I needed to make sure I was protected, to make sure this wasn't just a dream or a fluke. The lawyer confirmed everything. The house, the property, everything was indeed mine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The fight for the house wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for my identity, for the recognition I had never received. Ben might have thought he had everything figured out, but the truth was, he had always been living in a fantasy. And now, I was the one who had to live in the reality of it. What followed was a blur of angry messages, emails, and calls, not just from Ben, but from people who had somehow been roped into Ben's web of lies. They didn't know the truth, and neither did I. But I wasn't about to let this continue. I had a right to this house, to the memories it held, and to the life that had been promised to me from the start. I would no longer stand in the shadows of a legacy I had been robbed of for so long. This was my time. The days after Ben found out felt like a slow-moving storm. Every time I checked my phone, there were messages from him, angry texts, desperate voicemails, and even some from family friends who had been promised use of the house for their vacations. It was as if they all believed Ben's version of events. My phone buzzed incessantly, and I forwarded each message to my lawyer, trying to keep track of everything that was happening. I couldn't help but wonder how Ben had manipulated everyone so easily. My lawyer, Mr. Sullivan, had been a quiet ally throughout this process. He had been the one to first uncover the legal documents, and now he was helping me navigate the fallout from Ben's discovery. "They're getting desperate," he said during one of our weekly calls. I could hear the calm in his voice, but I wasn't sure how long that would last. My brother was a master of manipulation, and I knew he wouldn't give up easily. One afternoon, as I drove to the house to check on things, I found myself dreading what I might find. I'd been away for a few days, and I knew Ben had likely started making his move. I parked in the driveway, the familiar sight of the house standing silently in front of me. But everything felt different. The garden that had once been so full of life was now a mess, with half the flowers ripped out and a pile of construction materials stacked carelessly near the dock. A dumpster sat at the end of the driveway, filled with old furniture and fixtures from inside the house. The sight made my stomach turn. This was not just about a house. It was about what the house represented. It was about the years of memories my family had built there, and Ben was willing to throw it all away for a profit. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the damage, knowing I'd need them for later. Just as I was snapping the last photo, a sleek black car drove up the driveway. It was Ben. He got out, his face pale, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was finally seeing reason. But when he saw me, his expression hardened and the tension between us was palpable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp. I could tell he had no intention of backing down, and I wasn't going to let him walk all over me anymore. "I'm here to make sure you understand that this property is not yours to destroy," I said firmly, keeping my composure. "This is my home, Ben, not yours." His face turned red, and I could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't have any right to be here," he spat. "This is my inheritance, and I'm going to do with it what I want." The words stung, but I didn't flinch. "Your inheritance?" I repeated, my voice cold. Funny, because according to the legal documents, it's mine. The shock on his face was almost satisfying, but I knew it wouldn't last. He had always thought he was entitled to everything, and this was the first real challenge to that belief. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his voice low and threatening. "You're not getting away with this, you know," he warned. "I'll fight you for it, and I won't lose." There it was, the old Ben, the one who believed that if he just pushed hard enough he could get whatever he wanted. But this time I wasn't going to let him win. "You're wasting your time," I said, my voice unwavering. "You can't change the truth, Ben. This house is mine, and you know it." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ben stood there seething with rage while I stood my ground. I could see him trying to figure out his next move, but the realization was beginning to sink in that his plans had been upended. He didn't have the power here anymore. Not over the house, not over me. "You think you're so clever," he sneered. But there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "I've already spoken to the contractors. They're starting next week. I'll have this place the way I want it in no time." My heart sank. He hadn't just planned to take the house. He'd already started making changes to it as though it were already his. "No, you won't," I said, stepping forward and standing tall. "The trust stipulates that no work can be done without my approval, and I'm not approving anything. If you want to keep pushing this, I'll have the contractors legally bound to remove everything." Ben was quiet for a moment, staring at me, as if weighing his options. Then, his face twisted into a sneer, and he threw one last jab. "You're going to regret this, you know," he said, backing away slowly. "This isn't over." But I knew it was. The legal documents were clear, and I was prepared to fight. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just the quiet sibling watching from the sidelines. I was the one in control, the one standing up for what was rightfully mine. I wasn't going to let Ben or anyone else take that away from me. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table going through the lawyer's documents one more time, I felt a sense of clarity. I knew I was doing the right thing, but I also knew that this battle wasn't over. Ben was a determined man, and if he wanted the house, he would fight until the end. But I had something he didn't: truth, and a will that had been written long before he ever thought about claiming what wasn't his. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't just about a house. It was about everything it represented: the memories, the legacy, and the bond our family had once shared. I wasn't going to let that be destroyed. Not without a fight. The following days were filled with a mix of mounting frustration and unexpected clarity. I had been bracing myself for Ben to escalate things, and sure enough, he did. His anger simmered beneath the surface, and his calls became increasingly frantic. He wasn't just angry about the house, he was angry at me, at the fact that I had the nerve to take what he thought was rightfully his. And then, as if to make matters worse, he started reaching out to other family members, trying to sway them to his side, telling them how unfair it all was. But what struck me the most wasn't the lies he was spreading. It was how easily everyone seemed to believe him. People who had once known me, loved me, had now been swept up in his version of the story. My calls went unanswered, my emails ignored, while Ben's voice echoed in the background, manipulating everyone he could. It was a reminder of how deeply entrenched his power had always been, not just over the house, but over the entire family. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting to be seen, to be heard. Ben had taken everything from me without a second thought. He had taken our parents' love, their trust, and now he was trying to take my future as well. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted, and the situation grew more intense. I began to receive letters, official-looking ones from Ben's lawyer, demanding that I hand over the property. The tone of the letters was sharp, threatening, as if he had all the power in the world, and I was just a nuisance in his way. The letters, full of legal jargon, were meant to intimidate me. But they didn't. They only fueled my determination. One afternoon, as I sat in my living room, trying to sort through the legal mess, I got an unexpected call from Mr. Sullivan. "It's time to escalate," he said simply. His voice was calm but resolute, the kind of voice that made it clear he had already been preparing for this moment. He'd been gathering evidence, looking into Ben's past actions, and what he found was unsettling. "Ben isn't just trying to take the house, Olivia," Mr. Sullivan continued. "He's trying to build a case, one that'll make it look like you're the one at fault here." My heart sank. I hadn't expected him to go that far. I had always known Ben had a way of twisting the truth, but this felt different. He wasn't just being manipulative. He was being malicious. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Ben was planning something. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. He was desperate, and desperation made people do dangerous things. But I wasn't going to let him succeed. Not now. Not when I was so close to protecting what was rightfully mine. The trust my grandmother had set up wasn't just about securing the house. It was about securing my future. It was about securing the memories that had been left to me, and I wasn't going to let anyone erase that. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I received a message from Ben, asking to meet. The message was oddly polite, which only made me more suspicious. He said he wanted to work things out. He wanted to negotiate. I knew exactly what that meant. He wanted me to back down. He wanted me to hand over the house willingly so he could continue his plans without interference. But I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I agreed to meet him, but I wasn't going to let him manipulate me this time. When I arrived at the meeting place, a small cafe on the edge of town, Ben was already sitting at a table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He looked calm, collected, but I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his voice smooth, trying to hide the edge of desperation. "You're my sister, Olivia, your family. We should be able to figure this out without fighting." His words were carefully chosen, meant to sound like concern. But I wasn't fooled. "You're right," I said, leaning forward. "We shouldn't be fighting. But we are because you're trying to take something that doesn't belong to you." Ben stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice suddenly harder. "I need this. The house, the money, everything. It's not just for me, it's for us. For our future." I could hear the desperation in his voice now, the cracks in his facade beginning to show. I shook my head, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger. "No, Ben, it's not for us, it's for you. And you've always thought that because you were the firstborn, the one who followed the rules, you were entitled to everything. But you're not. You never were." His face flushed with frustration. "I don't know what happened to you," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "You used to be reasonable. You used to understand how things worked." I stood as well, meeting his gaze firmly. "Things are different now. I'm not the person you can push around anymore." There was a long silence between us, and for a moment, I saw the man Ben could have been. The man who might have been willing to fight for his family instead of just for himself. But that man was gone. The anger in his eyes was unmistakable now. He didn't care about family, not really. He only cared about winning. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "You'll regret this." But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had the truth on my side, and I had the legal protection of the trust. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. I walked out of the cafe with my head held high, feeling the weight of the world slowly lifting from my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but I was finally in control. Ben could threaten me all he wanted, but in the end, the truth would win. The house would stay where it belonged, with me. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take that away. The days that followed were a mix of quiet moments and escalating tension. I knew Ben wasn't going to give up easily, but each time he tried to move forward with his plans, something seemed to stop him. The contractors he had hired started pulling back, uncertain of the legal standing of the work they were supposed to begin. I watched as the house that had once felt so full of warmth and life now stood in limbo, caught between the past and Ben's desperate future. Each time I stepped onto the property, it felt as though the weight of our family history pressed down on me. My grandmother's voice, though silent, was never far from my thoughts. She had fought for this house for the legacy it held, and now it was up to me to protect it. Ben's desperation grew more apparent by the day. I began receiving increasingly aggressive messages from his lawyer, threatening lawsuits and questioning the legitimacy of the trust. He was playing his cards, trying to use every possible tactic to break me down. But with each new letter, I felt more resolute. I had already faced the worst of it. The truth was on my side, and the more Ben pushed, the more his actions revealed his true intentions. He didn't care about the house or the memories it held. To him, it was just a piece of property to flip, to sell for profit. But to me, it was everything. It was my past, my family, and my future. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of the house, I received another call from Mr. Sullivan. The tone of his voice was calm, but I could sense the tension underneath. "Olivia, I think it's time you prepare for the next step. Ben is planning something big. He's not going to stop just because the law is on your side." I sat up straight, my mind racing. What could he possibly be planning now? "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky with the realization that this fight was far from over. "I've been keeping an eye on Ben's financial moves. He's been making arrangements with some potential buyers. People who are willing to pay a lot of money for the property, more than its current market value. I'm afraid he's planning to sell it behind your back." My heart sank. This was what I had feared all along. Ben had been playing this game for more than just a house. He was in it for the money, the status, and the power. He didn't care about the legacy that had been passed down to me. "We need to stop him," I said, my voice steady now. "We need to stop him before it's too late." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings and discussions with Mr. Sullivan. We had to move quickly. The stakes were higher now, and the pressure was on. Ben wasn't just trying to steal the house. He was actively looking for ways to sell it, to erase everything that had been built there over the years. I knew I couldn't let him succeed. Not now, not after everything that had happened. It was only a matter of time before Ben made his move. I received word that he had scheduled a meeting with some investors, people who had no idea about the true legal status of the property. I knew this was it. If I didn't act now, Ben would find a way to sell the house out from under me, and I would lose everything my grandmother had worked so hard to protect. Mr. Sullivan and I made a plan. We would confront Ben before he could seal the deal with the investors. We would show them the truth, the legal documents, and the history behind the trust. The day of the confrontation, my nerves were frayed, but I knew I had to do this. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. I was fighting for everything that mattered: my family, my legacy, and my place in the world. As I arrived at the meeting spot, I could see Ben already standing there, talking to a group of well-dressed men. He was trying to charm them, trying to make them see the value in the property, to convince them that this was a great investment. But when he saw me approaching, his face changed. His smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "You're too late," Ben said, his voice tight with frustration. "The deal is already in motion. These men are ready to buy. There's nothing you can do to stop it." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I didn't let it show. "Actually, Ben," I said, my voice calm and controlled, "you're wrong. I'm not too late. The house isn't yours to sell." I pulled out the legal documents, the ones that proved beyond a doubt that I was the rightful heir, that the house was protected under the trust. "You can't sell it. The law won't let you." The investors exchanged looks, clearly confused. They had no idea what was going on, and I wasn't about to let Ben pull the wool over their eyes. I turned to them and explained everything: the trust, the provisions, and the fact that Ben had been trying to manipulate everyone involved. The silence in the air was deafening as the investors processed the information. Ben, realizing he had no way out, clenched his fists. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth, but his voice lacked conviction. The investors, now fully informed, turned their backs on him, one by one. They weren't interested in a property that came with so many legal complications. I could see the frustration in Ben's eyes, but he had lost. The battle for the house was finally over. That night, As I sat on the porch watching the sunset over the lake, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The house was safe. The memories it held were secure. Ben had been defeated, not just by the law, but by the truth. I had stood my ground, and in the end, that was what mattered most. But it wasn't just about the house. It was about the lessons I had learned along the way. The importance of standing up for what was mine, of never backing down, and of always protecting what mattered. As I looked out at the calm waters of the lake, I realized that the fight wasn't just about winning. It was about knowing when to let go and when to hold on. I had fought for the house, but in the end, I had fought for something deeper. I had fought for the family I had lost and the one I was starting to rebuild. Ben's influence had faded, and the house, my inheritance, would remain a symbol of resilience, of the ties that bound us, and of the strength to protect what was rightfully mine. The days that followed the confrontation felt quieter, almost surreal. It was as if everything had paused for a moment, allowing me to take a breath and process everything that had happened. Ben had backed off, for now. The investors were gone, the legal challenges had been set aside, and the house was, at least for the time being, secure. But despite the victory, a part of me couldn't help but feel unsettled. The storm hadn't passed completely. I knew Ben wasn't the kind of person who would simply give up. He was angry, and anger didn't dissipate easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I spent the next few weeks focusing on what I had to do. I had to start the process of restoring the house, not just physically, but emotionally. There was so much work ahead of me, but each task felt like a small step toward reclaiming the life my family had once shared there. As I walked through the house, I noticed the small details that had always made it feel like home. The way the light streamed through the old kitchen window in the morning, the creaky floorboards I knew so well, my grandmother's rocking chair, still sitting by the fireplace. It was these things, these small memories, that made the house feel like more than just property. It was a living, breathing part of my family's history, and it was mine to protect. In the weeks following, I began receiving fewer messages from Ben, though I knew it wasn't over. The silence felt like the calm before the storm. The last message I had gotten from him was short, just a few words. "This isn't finished," it said. That was it. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had really happened. I knew what it meant. Ben was going to find another way to take what he thought was his. He couldn't accept defeat. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from Mr. Sullivan. "Olivia," he said, his voice urgent, "we need to talk." My heart sank. It had only been a few days since the last confrontation, and already there was more trouble. I agreed to meet him at his office. When I arrived, he was already sitting at his desk, papers spread out in front of him. He didn't waste any time. "Ben's trying something else. He's filed for a formal claim against the house, alleging that your grandmother's will was invalid," Mr. Sullivan explained. My stomach turned. What? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He's claiming the will wasn't legally binding. He's going to argue that your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she wrote it. My mind was spinning. This was a tactic I had expected, but hearing it so plainly made it real. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "We have to prepare for a court battle, Olivia. This is going to get ugly. Ben will do anything to get what he wants, and this time, he's using the law to try to turn things in his favor." I nodded slowly. The weight of the situation settled on my shoulders, but I knew there was no turning back. If Ben thought I was going to just hand over the house, he was gravely mistaken. In the weeks that followed, the legal battle intensified. Ben threw everything he had at me: claims of fraud, allegations about my grandmother's mental state, even questioning the integrity of the people who had witnessed the will. But despite all of it, I remained calm. Mr. Sullivan worked tirelessly on my behalf, collecting evidence, finding witnesses, and making sure every detail was in place. But the most important thing I had was the truth. My grandmother's love for the house, her desire to keep it in the family, and the careful planning she had put into the trust. It wasn't just a house, it was her legacy, and I was the one she had chosen to protect it. One afternoon, as the court date approached, I found myself standing in front of the house again, just as I had so many times before. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the garden. I could hear the faint sound of the lake in the distance, a quiet reminder of everything that had brought me here. I thought of my grandmother, of how she had spent so many years tending to the garden, of all the lessons she had taught me. She had always said that the best way to protect something was to be prepared, and that's what I had done. I had done everything she had taught me, not just in protecting the house, but in standing up for what was right. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my family, for the memories we had shared, and for the future I wanted to build here. The fight had changed me. It had made me stronger, more resilient, and more determined than I had ever been. I wasn't the second-place sibling anymore. I wasn't the overlooked one. I was the one who had fought for what was mine, and I was going to win. The day of the hearing came, and the courtroom was tense. Ben sat across from me, his face tight with anger. He had tried every trick he could think of, but I had something stronger: the truth. And when Mr. Sullivan presented the evidence, the judge took only a few moments to decide. It wasn't even close. The will was upheld. The house was mine. Ben, stunned and speechless, stood up slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, but there was no conviction behind it. I knew then that he had finally realized he had lost. The house wasn't his to take. It never had been. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was over. The house was safe, and with it, the memories and legacy of my family. But the real victory wasn't just in winning the house, it was in reclaiming my place in the family and finally standing up for myself, and in making sure that the values my grandmother had passed down would never be forgotten. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had made me who I was today. And as I returned to the house, I knew that it was more than just a piece of property. It was home, and it always would be. The weeks following the court battle passed by slowly, but there was a peacefulness that I hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the fight was finally over, and as I spent more time at the house, I could feel the tension that had hung in the air for so long begin to lift. Ben had finally backed down, and though I knew he wasn't happy about it, I had come to realize that his bitterness didn't matter anymore. The house was mine. And more importantly, it was a place where I could heal, rebuild, and honor the legacy my grandmother had left behind. As the summer days grew longer, I focused on restoring the house to its former glory. The garden, once neglected, was slowly coming back to life. I spent hours every weekend planting flowers, trimming hedges, and carefully tending to the space that had always felt like home. My father, now more present than he had been in years, came by to help. There were moments when we worked together in silence, but it was a comfortable silence filled with understanding. As we worked side by side, I saw in him the same man who had once taught me how to fish by the lake, the same man who had shared quiet moments with me by the fire. We had both been through so much, but here in the garden it felt like we were starting to rebuild something together. Occasionally, Ben would reach out, but his messages were fewer and farther between. I knew he hadn't completely given up, but there was nothing more he could do. The house was mine, and I was determined to keep it that way. I would continue to protect it, not just because it was a part of my inheritance, but because it was a symbol of everything that had come before me. The memories of my grandparents, of family gatherings, of summers spent by the lake. It was a reminder of the love and lessons that had been passed down to me, and I wasn't going to let that slip away. One evening, as I stood on the porch watching the sunset over the lake, my father came to stand beside me. We watched in silence as the sky turned pink and gold, the air filled with the soft sounds of the evening. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, I felt content. My father turned to me, a soft smile on his face. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said quietly. "You fought for this place, and you protected it. I don't think I ever really understood what it meant, but I do now." I smiled, my heart warming at his words. She always said that the best place to start is wherever you're standing, I replied, looking out at the view that had meant so much to her and now meant so much to me. As we stood there together, I realized that the house had become something more than just a property. It had become a bridge, a way for my father and me to reconnect, to rebuild our relationship and our family. The garden wasn't just being restored physically, it was also healing the wounds of the past. And I knew that, in time, I would pass it on, just as my grandmother had passed it to me. The legacy would continue, not just in the walls of the house, but in the love and memories it held. In that moment, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I understood the real value of what I had fought for. It wasn't just the house or the inheritance, it was the opportunity to preserve something that mattered, something that could bring us all together again. And as I stood there with my father, the house no longer felt like a battlefield or a burden. It felt like home, a place of healing, a place of love, and a place where the story of our family could continue to unfold, one chapter at a time. Ben may have tried to take it all away, but in the end he couldn't. Because some things like family, history, and love are stronger than any fight. And as I looked out over the lake, I knew that the house and everything it stood for was safe, just as it always had been meant to be.